Revolutionary Russia, 1891 to 1991. Written by Orlando Figes. Introduction. A society poised to break. Russia entered the 1890s carrying the weight of an old empire and the shock of a new age. Industrial growth did not gently modernize society, it strained it. In the countryside, peasants faced land hunger, debt, and recurring scarcity. In the cities, factories concentrated workers into harsh living conditions where solidarity could form quickly and grievances could spread even faster. The state stood above this turbulence like a rigid tower, impressive but brittle. Modernization sharpened questions the empire could not answer. If people were being pulled into modern economic life, why were they still excluded from modern political life? If the state demanded loyalty and sacrifice, why did it offer so little dignity or security in return? The more the economy changed, the more the political system looked like a locked door, guarded, silent, and unresponsive. Repression did not erase opposition, it trained it. Censorship and police surveillance pushed movements underground, where secrecy strengthened discipline and radical ideas gained moral urgency. Reform began to feel unrealistic. For many, only a complete break seemed capable of resolving the mismatch between a modernizing society and a frozen autocratic state. By the early 20th century, revolution was no longer a distant threat. It was a pressure system building in plain sight. Through strikes, rural unrest, ideological polarization, and a deepening sense that the old order could not adapt without destroying itself. Chapter 1. War, Hunger, and the Fall of Tsarism. The First World War did not merely damage Imperial Russia, it exposed it. Mobilization strained the economy, transport networks buckled, and food distribution faltered. Soldiers faced shortages and disastrous leadership, while families at home endured inflation and breadlines. War turned discontent into anger, because sacrifice produced no stability, only loss and humiliation. The battlefield corroded loyalty. When soldiers feel abandoned by the state, poorly supplied, poorly led, and treated as disposable, the idea of duty collapses. Desertion increased, discipline weakened, and confidence in the monarchy evaporated. The regime's legitimacy did not fall because people suddenly changed their minds. It fell because institutions failed in ways people could not ignore. In the cities, shortages made politics physical. Hunger is not an abstraction. It is the loudest argument. Demonstrations expanded, strikes multiplied, and women demanding bread ignited a wider revolt. When soldiers refused to fire on crowds, the state lost its final instrument of control. Autocracy collapsed quickly because it had already lost the moral authority that makes control sustainable. The Tsar's abdication ended a dynasty, but it did not create order. The old system vanished, leaving a vacuum filled by competing authorities, provisional leaders, Soviets, parties, and street power. Revolution had removed the roof. Now the struggle was over. Who would build the new house? Chapter 2. Dual Power and the Road to October. After the monarchy fell, Russia entered an unstable phase where legitimacy was divided. The provisional government claimed formal authority, but the Soviets held real influence in factories, barracks, and streets. This was not simply political complexity. It was a crisis of command. When society does not know who governs, every problem becomes a battle over authority. The war continued, worsening the economy and exhausting patience. Land remained unresolved, and the countryside grew restless. Workers demanded control and dignity. Soldiers wanted peace. The longer uncertainty lasted, the more radical solutions gained appeal, not because they were gentle, but because they were decisive. In this environment, disciplined political organization mattered more than idealistic debate. The Bolsheviks advanced a message that felt concrete to suffering people: end the war, give land, transfer power. Their strength lay in clarity and readiness, while rivals were trapped between reform and revolution, between legality and necessity. By October, the seizure of power was less a spontaneous uprising than a strategic takeover of key points: communications, institutions, decision centers. Power shifted under the claim of popular authority, but the deeper reality was that Russia moved from divided legitimacy to concentrated force. Chapter 3: Civil War and the Hardening of the State. Civil war turned revolutionary promise into national catastrophe. Multiple armies fought across the former empire, foreign intervention intensified chaos, and local violence became routine. Cities starved, villages were requisitioned, and survival replaced ideology as the daily concern. In such conditions, politics becomes inseparable from coercion. The Bolsheviks won not because society had reached unanimous agreement, but because they built centralized control while opponents remained fragmented. Organization, discipline, and ruthless measures helped them outlast their rivals. Victory came at a massive human cost, and it normalized the idea that terror could be a tool of governance rather than an emergency exception. Institutions created in war rarely vanish in peace. Surveillance, censorship, and political policing expanded, justified by the belief that enemies were everywhere. Counter-revolution became a label that could be applied broadly, turning dissent into treason. Fear became administrative. By the early 1920s, a new state existed, born in violence and trained in suspicion. The revolution did not merely overthrow a regime, it created a governing style shaped by emergency logic, where coercion felt permanent because danger was declared permanent. Chapter 4: Stalinism and the Machinery of Transformation. Under Stalin, the state aimed at total remaking. Collectivization uprooted rural life, breaking peasant autonomy and forcing agriculture into centralized structures. Industrialization demanded speed and sacrifice, transforming labor into a moral duty enforced by discipline. These were not gentle reforms. They were campaigns backed by coercion. The countryside paid a terrible price. Resistance was crushed, mass displacement reshaped communities, and famine turned policy into tragedy. The purpose was not only economic, it was political. By breaking independent rural life, the state eliminated a rival source of identity and control. In the cities, new hierarchies formed around loyalty, production, and ideological performance. The promise of a new society came with the constant shadow of suspicion. The purges extended terror into the party itself, eliminating rivals and deepening the lesson that no one was safe from accusation. Fear was not incidental. It was functional. Stalinism created power and modernization, but it also created trauma as a social condition. People learned to survive through silence, conformity, and careful public speech. The revolution's original language of liberation survived, but the lived reality was discipline and fear. Chapter 5: War, Victory, and the Soviet Imperial Moment. World War II reshaped the Soviet story. The invasion threatened the state's existence, forcing mobilization on a scale that consumed society. Suffering was vast: battlefield losses, civilian deaths, destroyed cities, hunger, displacement. Yet the war also forged a powerful narrative of sacrifice and survival that the regime would later use to legitimize itself. The wartime experience changed the relationship between state and people. Survival required endurance, and endurance created a harsh unity. Patriotism fused with ideology, not always because people believed every slogan, but because the threat was real and immediate. The war demanded discipline and gave the state a heroic frame: defender, savior, victor. Victory elevated the Soviet Union into a superpower and expanded its influence across Eastern Europe. But imperial power brought new burdens: occupation, rivalry, and the need to maintain control over diverse societies. The state's security instincts intensified, shaping the early Cold War climate of suspicion and closed borders. The war also left deep scars inside Soviet life: grief carried in families, ruined cities rebuilt under strain, and a society asked to celebrate triumph while still living in deprivation. Victory became a pillar of legitimacy, but it could not erase the cost. It strengthened the state even as it exhausted the people. Chapter 6: Thaw, Reform, and the Limits of Change. After Stalin's death, terror softened, but control did not disappear. The system adjusted rather than transformed. People experienced a partial release, less fear of sudden arrest, more space for private life. But the foundations of one-party rule remained. Stability became the new promise. Efforts to reform exposed a paradox. The system needed change to survive, yet deep change threatened its monopoly on authority. Bureaucracy expanded, and ideology often became ritual: spoken, repeated, performed, more than genuinely believed. The gap between official language and lived reality widened. Society adapted into a dual existence: public conformity and private skepticism. People learned how to navigate institutions, how to speak carefully, how to keep life functioning without trusting the system's promises. This adaptation produced stability, but it also drained conviction. Reform produced expectations that the system could not satisfy. Once people taste openness, they begin to measure truth against propaganda and reality against slogans. The state could manage fear more easily than it could manage rising expectations. Chapter 7: Stagnation, Unraveling, and Collapse. Over time, the Soviet system grew heavy. Economic growth slowed, innovation lagged, and bureaucracy thickened into a culture of inertia. Daily life continued, but with a spreading cynicism: compliance without belief. Ideology survived as performance, and many people simply learned to live around the system rather than inside it. When openness arrived late in the century, it did not merely reveal problems, it multiplied them. Historical crimes, corruption, inefficiencies, and lies surfaced publicly. The state's moral authority weakened because the official narrative could no longer protect itself. Once truth becomes discussable, silence stops functioning as glue. Economic restructuring shook the social contract. Stability had been the system's bargain: limited freedom in exchange for predictable life. When predictability weakened and shortages worsened, frustration grew. National movements re-emerged, challenging centralized authority. The union's cohesion, already hollowed, could not withstand renewed pressure. Collapse came faster than many expected because belief had already collapsed. Institutions can survive hardship, but they struggle to survive emptiness. When people no longer feel the system as meaningful, it becomes brittle. By 1991, the revolutionary century ended, not with a final dramatic battle, but with a disintegration that revealed how exhausted the project had become. Conclusion: Revolutionary Russia is a century-long lesson in the power and danger of political dreams. The revolution began in real suffering and real hope, and it unleashed genuine transformation: industrial modernization, global power, new social identities. But it also normalized coercion as a governing method, turning emergency logic into permanent structure. Across time, ideals hardened into institutions, and institutions hardened into control. The system could mobilize society with immense force, yet it struggled to sustain trust and autonomy. Many people survived by adapting, by speaking one language in public and another in private, until the distance between life and ideology became too wide to ignore.
In the end, the Soviet collapse showed that power built on coercion and ritual can endure for decades, but it becomes fragile when belief drains away. The century closes with a paradox, a revolution that changed everything, and a state that could not renew itself enough to survive the truth it finally allowed.